All right, so today we're gonna dive into something that's been making a lot of waves in the world of global trade,
Yeah.
and that is, these recent U.S. tariffs that have been announced, and we're gonna look at them particularly from the perspective of, a small open economy like Singapore.
Right.
And the source material we're using is a video transcript of Singapore's Prime Minister Lawrence Wong speaking on CNA's YouTube channel.
Okay.
And, I think the real mission here is to try to understand, what these tariffs might signal in terms of a larger reshaping of the world order,
Yeah.
and what that might mean for all of us.
Well, one thing that jumps out from PM Wong's analysis is his view that this really marks a kind of a fundamental shift.
Yeah.
He really stresses that the U.S. announcement is a departure from what we've known as rules-based globalization.
Right.
The system where trade is largely governed by agreed-upon international rules and institutions.
Hmm.
And he uses some pretty strong language to describe it. He actually calls it a Liberation Day announcement by the U.S. So there's definitely a sense that this is a break from the established order.
So it's like the end of an era in a way.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
And he talks about this era, this potentially ending by pointing out that, the U.S. was really the architect
Right.
of this system in a lot of ways, the bedrock for the free market economies, and the driving force behind setting up the World Trade Organization, the WTO.
Exactly.
And he gives credit to this system, this framework with, really fostering unprecedented global stability and economic growth, including for the U.S. itself.
Mm.
So it's not just, some minor adjustments we're talking about here.
Absolutely not. He's very clear that Singapore, like many other countries, has supported reforming the WTO
Yeah.
and making it better.
Sure.
But he sees these actions by the U.S. as a much more drastic step.
Right.
He says it's a complete rejection of that system.
Wow.
And they're opting instead for these reciprocal tariffs country by country.
Yeah.
So that, really moves away from the multilateral approach of the WTO.
Yeah. And this has a direct impact on Singapore. They're facing a 10% tariff from the U.S.
Right.
They've been put in the lowest base tier.
Yeah.
But PM Wong does say, the direct economic hit might be limited, at least for now.
Yeah, at least initially. But, the concern he raises is, what if everyone starts doing this?
Right, right.
What if other major economies follow the U.S.'s lead and start prioritizing these bilateral agreements over the WTO system?
Exactly.
And that's where the real risk comes in for smaller trade-dependent nations like Singapore. They could get squeezed out, marginalized, and left behind.
Yeah, that paints a pretty concerning future.
It does.
And, along those lines, he anticipates a pretty strong global response and even raises the likelihood of a full-blown global trade war.
Yeah, a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, it's interesting, though, that Singapore's chosen not to retaliate with their own tariffs.
Right.
But he hints that other countries, might not show that same restraint.
Yeah. And when you connect all of this to, the broader economic picture, the potential negative consequences are pretty huge.
Right.
PM Wong talks about international trade and investment suffering and ultimately leading to slower global growth.
Mm-hmm.
And he emphasizes that Singapore, because of how deeply integrated they are into global trade networks, they're going to be disproportionately affected by this.
Yeah, he even drew a parallel to the 1930s.
Oh, wow.
Which is kind of scary, a period marked by those escalating trade wars that ultimately contributed to, wider conflict.
And nobody wants to see that happen again.
Exactly, though, of course, he's careful to say, no one can predict the future.
Of course.
But it does feel like there's a deeper shift happening here,
Yeah.
that he's talking about.
Like a change in the underlying dynamics?
Yeah, like he observes this weakening of, international institutions and kind of a fading of those established global norms and a growing tendency for countries to just act in their own narrow self-interest, even resorting to, pressure tactics or even force.
Yeah.
So what is Singapore doing about all this?
Well, PM Wong lays out a strategy that focuses on staying vigilant, keeping a close eye on things,
Okay.
strengthening their own national capabilities so they're not so reliant on others,
Right.
and then also really working on building stronger partnerships with like-minded nations.
Yeah.
And he highlights their existing strengths, things like their financial reserves, their social cohesion, their national resolve.
Right.
I think ultimately his message, and it's a message for all of us, is
Yeah.
one of preparedness.
Yeah.
He doesn't want people to be lulled into complacency because this global calm and stability we once knew will not return anytime soon.
So the key takeaway, I think, from all this is that we are witnessing, a pretty major shift in global trade policy.
Yeah.
And this has the potential for, some pretty widespread consequences, particularly for economies that are heavily reliant on international trade, like Singapore.
And it really raises the question, given these changes in global trade and this potential weakening of international cooperation, how might different countries be affected?
Right.
And what are the implications for global stability and the existing international order?
Yeah.
It really, makes you think about how interconnected our world is and how fragile these systems we often take for granted can be.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive,
My pleasure.
and we'll see you next time.
See you.
Bye.